How would anarchism look like in an Indian context? Well, the concepts of India, Pakistan, etc., wouldn't exist. So this concept of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal and all this wouldn't exist to begin with. It would just be workers, not just workers, but people in general, trying to build sustainable communities, sustainable, environmental friendly. Like I want trams in all these cities, right? I want trams in Chennai. I want trams in Quetta. I want trams in Srinagar and Dras and Itanagar and all these different places. I just want infrastructure at the very end of the day. And anarchy works. Anarchy can build that. But inter-community cooperation would be needed for larger projects. Exactly. You would need that. But there's nothing within a libertarian socialist framework that prevents that from happening. So Mad Max, bro? No, it's not Mad Max, guys. It's not Mad Max. That's not what anarchy is. No, how do you do that without tax collection? Yes. Councils and elections, yes. There would be no parties, no political parties, period, because all political parties would be bourgeois. There's no one way to do things. That's basically the point that I'm getting at. It all depends. What I'm basically prescribing all depends entirely on the material conditions of that region. So is balkanization pro-anarchism? No, actually, balkanization is not pro-anarchism. That's not what that is. Balkanization is the creation of new ethno-states. Anarchism is the complete destruction of all nation states, but devolution of powers back to the community. That's what anarchism is at its very core. Yeah, balkanization creates more states. That's not what anarchism wants. Anarchism doesn't want that. Anarchism wants the opposite of that. It wants the destruction of states. Anarchism posits that the best way of achieving autonomy for a group of people is through a libertarian socialist framework. Communism has the theory of vanguard party revolution of proletariat on how to attain communism. What do you think is the practical step to anarchy? Anarchism posits something very different. And actually, it's not exclusive to anarchism, because communists do this too. Communists used to do this as well. Anarchy posits, especially anarcho-communists, but it also mutualists and whatnot, which is like the OG anarchists, mutualists are. They posit that the best way to achieve anarchy is through something called prefiguration. Prefiguration is the concept of building the society that you want to build for the future today. So basically, the idea of anarchy is if you want to build a more equitable society, you got to start on the ground level. You have to start doing things. Now, a lot of people conflate prefiguration with, just making mutual aid, like, making soup kitchens or something like that, or just building food for the community. I think prefiguration, the practice of prefiguration goes much deeper than that, in my opinion. I think a lot of people, a lot of anarchists especially, think that prefiguration stops at building soup kitchens, building mutual aid funds or something like that. I think, in my personal opinion, there are a multitude of ways you can start building that society that is not limited to just these very limited approaches, in my opinion, which is like just building soup kitchens, mutual aid funds. You can do lots of different things to start building the society that you want to build tomorrow, today. You can start building education materials. You can start making apps or whatever. You can do anything. Use the tools that you have right now to help out people. And I think another thing is that a lot of anarchists that I've seen have this weird thing about helping the people in your physical vicinity, right? That's who your community really is. People in your physical vicinity. I think that in the current age of the internet, communities can always be built anywhere. Information can be sent in milliseconds. You can always build your community somewhere. You can always educate people somewhere. 30 years ago, it was much harder to tell people outside of Elam what the Sri Lankan government was doing to the Elam Tamils. It was harder to tell people. But now, I can make a documentary, upload it online, for free, by the way, and have people watch it in a matter of months. I can do that for people. I can educate people that are living halfway across the world. It's easy I can have calls with people in Germany. I can have calls with people living in Pakistan or India or Bangladesh or whatever. Sure, the time zones are not going to work out perfectly fine. But now I can do that today. The issue with Marxism that exists in the subcontinent is that the vanguard is rarely made up of minorities or marginalized communities, and as I've learned fairly recently, that is a majority of the time upper caste is more willing to disregard politically inconvenient struggles to their own caste. Not to say class and caste are the same. There's a guy called Gabriel, I think his name is Gabriel Rockhill. This guy did a podcast with Amar Ali John. He made a point, which I think is interesting, but I disagree with him on. He was justifying a lot of China's actions on the world stage on the fact that China had to be pragmatic and they had to do things that contradict hardline Marxism or whatever, that contradicts classical Marxist doctrine in order to be more practical, right? And actually develop communism. And he was basically saying that Western Marxists are out of touch and everyone needs to return to Marx or whatever. And Amar Ali John was basically in agreement with Gabriel Rockhill on that. My problem with what Gabriel Rockhill has to say about the vanguard form of organization, yeah, you can make that argument about certain things that China did. I think a good example of China ultimately doing the right thing, but having really bad short-term consequences was banning stubble burning. China banning stubble burning, just outright banning it, hurt farmers in the short run. It was bad short-term, but eventually worked out long run because it meant that China was able to get rid of a lot of pollution. So if you're talking about that sort of thing, then I would agree with Gabriel Rockhill. I would agree with this guy. Yes, sometimes states make really short-term decisions that are really bad, short-term, but end up having a long-term benefit. The problem is that principle of Marxists have to do really up things in the short term in order to develop communism in the long term is not a blanket statement that can be applied everywhere. I'm basically summarizing his argument, and I'm not necessarily doing the best steel man of his argument. Yeah, he has a purely, I think, utilitarian perspective on this. We interviewed a Chinese author, Dongping Han, from the countryside that's actually very critical of the reforms in China and wrote a book of the unknown cultural revolution that I think you'd really appreciate. There are some things that happened in the cultural revolution that were extremely fucked up that I think people ignore, and I think that, like for example, the jailing of Tibetan communists and the jailing of Mongolian communists. Like people say that the Cultural Revolution was 100% a good thing because jailing Tibetan communists and jailing, what's his name? What was it? Phunsok Wangyal is his name. I think that was his name. And the jailing of Mongolian communists. That's bad. That's terrible. It is chauvinistic to do that. China jailed other communists? Yes, during the Cultural Revolution. Okay, so what happened was Tibetan communists were the ones that originally asked China to come and take over Tibet. Or not take over Tibet. They were the ones that asked China to depose the Dalai Lama. But what happened after that, unfortunately, was that the CPC was like, yeah, you Tibetan communists are no longer useful to us, so we're going to throw you in jail. Because the Tibetan communists originally, wanted an independent communist Tibet. But again, the CPC didn't want that. The CPC didn't want an independent communist Tibet. They saw Tibet as their territory. So they completely took over Tibet. Yes, the Tibetan communists wanted self-determination and they wanted to build a communist Tibet based on the material conditions in Tibet. But the CPC didn't allow them to do that. And a similar thing happened in Mongolia, in Inner Mongolia. So there are communists in China, what is now China, that wanted self-determination, that wanted to be able to build build communism on their terms, on Tibetan and Mongolian terms. But again, what the CPC has demonstrated is a flavor of Sinitic chauvinism, basically. Again, this is like particular nuance, right? The deposing of the Dalai Lama, the new Lankan president, is communist? No, he's not. Yeah, I know, dude, I know what the JVP is. JVP are Nazis. They're also Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists. They're also Nazis. I think some of the things that he says about short-term L's for long-term W's, I think there's some truth to what he's saying, right? For example, I think India just needs to outright ban stubble burning in order to get rid of the pollution in Delhi. I think that's the only way forward. You just have to take very authoritative actions in order to get this stuff done. It's going to hurt farmers in the short run, but in the long term, it'll help the entire country, right? It's a short-term sacrifice for a long-term gain. That's something I agree with Gabriel Rockhill on. But unfortunately, that train of thought is also the same train of thought that the JVP uses to justify going into military camps and being the biggest cheerleaders of war crimes against the Tamils. But the cost of hurting the farmers from it should be absorbed by the state and not the farmers. No, I understand. I know. I understand that. The socialist ideal of move fast and break things was not necessarily the best. No, sometimes the situation is so dire where you have to move fast and break things. Delhi is a great example. Delhi being one of the most polluted cities in the world, partially due to stubble burning. I think he has a point there. I think that's a lesson that China learned that India can absorb. I think that's a decision that China made that India can learn from, or that South Asia in general can learn from. But I think his train of logic of everything can be justified through this framework, I think that's a very dangerous gambit that he's playing here. And also, and again, I'm vastly oversimplifying my understanding of China. The reason that China was able to develop so well is partially due to their codependence on the United States for trade, because China is the manufacturing hub. China had social safety. It's not the best social safety net as you can imagine. I genuinely think the only way forward for the subcontinent is a confederation. I think that's the only way forward.